Okay, so just before we get started, I want to make sure everyone knows that we do record these presentations so that we can share them with people that are not able to attend this evening. So I like to throw that caution out there so that, if people don't want to share personal information when we take time for questions. So let's go ahead and get started. My name is Janet Griffith, and I'm here with Jay Berk. And tonight we're presenting on unique behaviors and social emotional needs and how those needs sort of manifest and create the need for additional supports in the school setting. So just by way of brief introduction, my name is Janet Fleck Griffith. I am an attorney at Hickman and Louder, part of our education team, which also includes Frank Hickman, who's been doing this for over 50 years, as well as an education advocate, Mary Jo O'Neill. Tonight, we have with us a special guest, Jay Berk, and I'll let him provide a brief introduction of himself.
This is my part where I'm supposed to go hi. So I just noticed I actually typed my last name without a capital. That was my sign in real quick. So anyhow, my name is Dr. Jay Berk. I'm a psychologist. My office is in Beechwood. I've been around for 300 million years. I do love invites like this because one of the things that we do at the office, which is a little different, is we look at kids' behaviors in therapy. We also have an alternative education program that houses a lot of kids. I have a summer camp program. But I think one of the biggest parts, and the reason I'm happy that Janet asked me to do this, is that, an hour of therapy is an hour of therapy. And beyond the hour of therapy is what's at home. And of course, for kids, especially the older they get, the more school becomes an important variable. Socialization, academic pressure, all those types of things that we see happening. And I think if you don't understand the whole circle, therapy just generally is not as effective with kids in that situation. So finishing my intro, and then Janet can talk a little bit more. But so as a psychologist, I consider myself kind of a unique animal in that I dip in the school part and I deal with those things. I've been a national presenter all over the world. But I think the thing about that is really listening to people and understanding the challenges that they have. I've also written 2 books, one of which I have up on the screen, Parents' Quick Guide to Electronic Addiction. If you're interested, it's on Amazon. But the reason that I put that up there, I have another book on social skills, is because electronics are so much a part of kids' lives today that almost everything is interwoven with it. Every kid has a Chromebook, and you're going to hand an ADHD distractible kid a Chromebook and say, don't go on sites you're not supposed to go on. Fat chance of that. Most kids know more about getting around things than the technology department at the school does. We get kids in trouble with that all the time. And so it's a lot that the parents need to know and keep up on, which I think is huge. Sextortion is a huge thing going on with kids now. I can talk about those things if people want. But I think that there's a lot of things happening, and technology is just going to be a huge interwoven piece. So my practice is Jay Berk PhD and Associates. Like I said, we have an alternative program called Perspectives Academy. And this summer, I have a camp that's 10-day overnight camp. That's a technology reduction social skills camp. That's for ages 9 to 20. And that sells out quick, but that's amazing how kids have lost touch with socialization. For example, if you have kids, as they get older, it's so much different than when we were kids. Kids don't go to other kids' houses like we did. They just get on the internet and on a game with their friend, and they'll be like, why should I go to a kid's house? So I just got done with social skills group. I have 15 different social skills groups that I run. They range in age from 8 to age 35. And social skills have become exceedingly complicated, much more different than when we were younger. So there's a brief intro. Janet, I'll let you take it back.
Okay, so what we like to do in our Hickman and Louder webinar series is bring a local practitioner like Jay Berk to our meetings to share with families from their perspective and what their practice has shown them. And then in the end, I like to wrap up with sort of the school piece. So we'll kick it back to Jay and he'll get things started for us.
Well, and I think too, maybe people can, is there somebody moderating that can grab chat questions or not?
You know what, Jay, I can keep an eye on things. So if people have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. That's a great point. So if you have questions, you can share in the chat. I usually try to tackle questions at the end. Is that good for you, Jay?
Well, sometimes they're related to the slide I'm on, so I'll let you read them and say,
Okay.
is it one for the slide or is it one for the end?
Yeah.
All
And
right, go ahead.
if you have questions, if because I do see a question in the chat already about getting additional information about Jay Berk's camps, I think they can go to your website for that information. Is that right, Jay?
Well, all right, let me address that
Yeah.
because it is a little confusing. So there's two businesses. There's J. Berk PhD and Associates. Okay, which the website for that, if you're interested, is jberkphd.com. Can you go back a slide, Janet, by chance?
Oh, yeah. Hold on. I'm never good at this, so bear with me, guys.
You
There
can
we go.
reverse.
There we go.
Okay, if you're interested in the camp, go to the socialskills360.com. That will be filling up. It's already getting closer to being full than empty. And all the information's on those two sites. Perspectives Academy, our alternative education program, is on the Jay Berk site. And we also started a new program called Perspectives Academy Plus, which is for individuals that are 17 and up and needing help with moving into the world. They have not been successful at college or job environment or things and need that little extra help. So the reason I'm saying this is not because to push business, because I'm not here for that. The real reason I'm saying this is that the reason that I created these programs is because I saw needs in the community. And the needs in the community are the most important thing to fill, I think. And even the idea of I've got 15 social skills groups and the idea of looking at what's going on socially with kids. And a lot of groups that are out there, they do workbooks, they have a lunch bunch at school, but it's got to be a live thing with what's going on with the kids that are in that group. So I can talk more about that if people have questions. So let's flip to the next slide, Janet. We'll go forward again. You got my pandemic slide? All right,
Yes.
so let's talk about this. I mean, the world's a changing place. I mean, it amazes me. Here's lines I hear as parents all the time. If I'd have done what he did, I'd have gotten killed. My parents, I would have never said what he said to me or she said to me, to my parents. I can't believe that this kid knew how to do X, Y, or Z. And the world is changing dramatically in terms of all of that. Now, part of that is video games, which I'll talk about later in the session. But does anybody, depending on your age, does anybody remember arcades? And you had to go and put a quarter in the arcade or a dime if you're old enough to remember. And you had to go somewhere. But kids don't have to do that anymore. Okay, so what happened was, I think when the pandemic hit, there is still a residual effect of the pandemic on kids. Now, depending on where your kid was at during the pandemic, some kids were at a crucial leap on social skills, like going from being little kids to where there's a social environment. So they never picked up the social skills. Some kids lost the academic skills because they were sitting at home doing academics. And a lot of my kids lost executive function skills. If you don't know what that is, That's basically organization, time management skills that they never developed. Now, I gave two examples of this because it's kind of funny when you work with kids all day. But kids talk to me, and I've got kids that went off to college that I talk to, and they're like, wow, college is harder than high school. I go, why? They're like, because I was in the pandemic in high school. And I go, what'd you do in high school? They go, cheated. Because everybody could have two screens up. They had the questions and the answers, answer sheet, and they just didn't learn the skill of learning. Also, kids didn't learn to sit in a class. Now, that is something else to think about too. You think, well, just sitting in a class. But for a lot of kids today, sitting in a class takes a lot of energy and a lot of time. And I could talk about cases, like I have a kid, for example, who they put in the front of the class in a standing desk. Now, a standing desk could be a great thing if it's used right, or sort of a punishment if it's not used in the appropriate way. But example is the ability to be able to sit and focus that long for some kids is a real issue. I don't think any of us remember a pandemic before this pandemic. So it is a different world due to that. And Janet, maybe you want to say something about what you see on your end from the pandemic. Would that be good?
Sure. I think that my big takeaway as a lawyer practicing in this field and as a mother of two elementary students is that there are like very simplified skills that were lost as a result of isolation during the pandemic. So things that I think are easy for adults to overlook, that are skills that kids learn as they are transitioned into school. So things like Jay alluded to, sitting in the classroom, right? Like, I think it's easy for an adult to sort of think like, yeah, kids go to school, they sit in the classroom. We don't think about that as a skill that they build when they transition from preschool or whatever they did before kindergarten, from kindergarten into, first through fifth grade. So I think there's, these skills that sort of fly under the radar a little bit that our kids are struggling with as a result of the pandemic. And then I think that it's going to be very fascinating to look back on this in a decade, because each age group is experiencing their own unique set of difficulties as a result of the isolation they experienced. So our preschool age kids, lost some important socialization in terms of like simple things like going to the grocery store, right? Like
Yeah.
I have a now 6-year-old, and he never did that with me at the typical time that my 8-year-old did it, right? Because we were isolating. So going to the grocery store and how to act in public, that's something he didn't know how to do as we began to reintegrate into society. Likewise, students sitting in classrooms, interacting with their peers, the sort of demands and responsibilities and school, like adult relationships that children experience in school. For some of our older kids, they suddenly had a 2-year gap in those expectations, right? And, if you think about where a middle schooler was when the pandemic started, or a fourth and fifth grader was when the pandemic started, there's all these social emotional skills that are soft skills that they learn by being in school, and they
Yeah.
suddenly had a 2-year window where they weren't being exposed to that environment and they weren't learning from that environment. Now you add on top of that the academic loss that kiddos experience, particularly our elementary students that would have been learning to read and were suddenly being taught to read virtually. I really think we are learning a lot about those deficits, and we're going to continue to learn about those deficits as we work with these kids and they begin to age up in the K-12 system. But one of the ways I think about school, and I often counsel my clients to think about school this way, is school is your testing ground for society. There is no other place in a child's life where they can go and be exposed to many peers in one setting, peers that span age groups, and adults that aren't their family, right? And so this is the most like the real world that they
Real
get.
life. Yeah.
Yep. And all of a sudden it was unplugged for 2 years. So I think there's a plethora of impacts in observing how each child experienced those impacts. I think anxiety has taken a different turn too. Not my area of expertise, that's Jay's, but I think, there's a host of things around anxiety that were impacted by the pandemic as well.
All right. So I appreciate that, Janet. So let me just say something related to that. Number one diagnosis in kids. Anybody got to guess what it is? Think about it for a second. Janet, what do you think it is?
Oh dear. I feel like I should know this. Anxiety.
Anxiety, right? And a
Yeah.
lot of kids with social anxiety now that didn't have social anxiety before, because there's a lot of subtypes of anxiety, right? So that's something to think about. And on the back side of this is pretty fascinating how the pandemic has changed once people leave school. Because what we noticed is a lot of people are working remotely. I'll say to kids, well, you have to have social skills to get along with people on a job. They're like, I'm going to work from home. Okay, and there's empty buildings. If you drive down 271, it amazes me how empty Progressive's parking lot is in the middle of a business day because people are working from home, Cleveland Clinic, etc. And so even my daughter works for a company. She lived in New York and now she lives in Texas, and she can live anywhere in the world and do her job, which is amazing. So some of those skills are not needed as much as they were. And for anybody that's older, you can think about jobs that existed when we were kids that no longer exist and I think of some fun ones. Does anybody who's old enough to remember an elevator operator, a payphone change collector? These are sort of fun ones to think about. Jobs that existed. And the flip side is jobs that are now going to exist that never existed before. So I'm getting kids going into things. I'm going, what is that you're doing? And it's amazing, like what's AI doing? And the access to technology and how much difference it's going to make. So I have a kid who's interested in music, and he's using AI to change his voice to famous musicians' voices and sing songs, which is just incredible. And he's in 6th grade. So there you go. All right, can you
And,
flip my slide?
yep. And Jay, while I'm flipping slides, I will add to that discussion that another thing we're seeing as a result of the pandemic is I think there's a lot more technology in the school day, particularly for younger kids. So we're seeing that, kids had to be issued Chromebooks, and there's all of these technological devices that are now in play beginning at kindergarten. So I think that's a interesting approach. I think there's some good and bad things about that. And certainly something that we're considering when we're negotiating IEP accommodations for students.
Right, because kids' mode of learning is different depending on the kid. But I think it's just amazing. And you see this in your law practice. And if you're a parent of a kid, don't be naive how quick they get on sites they're not supposed to be on, or something they're doing, and you think the school's technology is going to keep them off of it. Go on YouTube and they'll tell you how to get around it. All right, so often not always starts at home. And what I meant by that was basically thinking about behaviors that occur often, and are they at home or they're not at home. Now, the reason that I'm saying this is the psychologist side of me. Depends on what age people come in of their kid. Now, you're going to hear this a couple times, but the earlier you show up at a therapist's office, the more likely the outcome is going to be positive. Reasons people don't show up. The pediatrician told me he'll grow out of it. My husband and I don't agree on getting therapy. We don't want to put our kid on meds. I can give you a bunch of these. But I can tell you something, that most kids that I see that have issues, whatever it is, ADHD, depression, anxiety, learning issues, you name it, It occurs at home first. Okay, and then it will creep into other places. It starts bleeding over to the soccer team, to school, wherever it is. Now, people often think, well, isn't that cute that this kid is doing this? Now, an example I want to give you is one of my kids that I work with is twice exceptional. So he's on the spectrum and he's also gifted. And he's in second grade and probably could match up with any high school kid in terms of certain things of his interest. And he space. And as long as you're going to listen, he'll talk to you about it, which seems cute, but when you go to school and all you talk about is space, people want to send you into space if you don't shut up about space. And my point is that little kids are nice to you, but by about fifth grade, kids aren't so nice anymore about that. And so cute sort of wears off. Number two is they'll grow out of it. And this is not a knock on pediatricians, because pediatricians, they see your kid, they see you yearly, they see them if they got snot coming out of their nose, whatever it is. But, often they'll grow out of it. And I can tell you there's lots of kids that I see that if I'd have seen them earlier, I would have given parents some instructions that could have changed things. And I don't see the harm in getting that consult early on if you think that there's something going on with your child. I got to be careful what I say, so I'll just kind of say it this way. Sometimes there's kids that had difficult births, low APGAR scores, things like that the physician said they're going to be fine. And then later on, they have learning disabilities, they have processing issues. There's other things that I see. And so if I saw those kids earlier, I would try to give parents tips on how to mitigate that ahead of time. That doesn't mean that all those kids are going to have those things, but they're sort of like do no harm. This is a big one. Kids that behave for one parent in the home, but not the other parent. Now, a huge part of what I do is also work with parents, because parent coaching is a big part of the process. Now, if you drop your kid at therapy and you pick them up and you don't know what your kid's working on, I'm telling you, you should really think about that. Unless your kid's like older high school kid or something, even if they're in middle school, you should at least know the topic generally of what they're talking about, because that's important, because the therapist should know that piece. But the parent coaching part is this. Why do they behave for one parent? Is one parent more strict? Is one parent more lax? Is one parent similar? They have the same learning problems, so they understand the kid. Okay, but the bottom line is, if there's a split in the parenting, it generally is not a good situation. So unification of the parents, especially if a kid's going to maneuver between these parents, is important. So, for example, who's the kid going to go to? Well, we all remember being kids and you knew which parent of yours was easier to ask for something. But if it's going to create problems where the kid is getting away with stuff that's creating a problem, that's an issue. So it's building this whole child, school, home, parenting style that fits in. Different kids need different parents. So a lot of parents will be upset and say, I blew it. I didn't parent this kid right, blah, 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 blah. And, they have multiple kids and their other kids are coming along rockingly fine. And the answer is that different kids have different parent needs. And I think this is so super important to understand that you have a parenting style, mostly usually based on your parents, the way they raised you, and kind of who you are as a person. And your kid has a kid style. And sometimes the parent style and kid style match well, and sometimes they don't. So for example, some kids are cat kids. Now, here's the thing about me. I like dogs. I hate cats. But for example of speaking today, I will talk about cats. So some people, maybe some of you out there have a cat kid, and a cat kid's a kid who could just leave out food, leave the litter box, and the kid would raise himself. And if you have that kind of kid, your parenting style doesn't matter as much as, for example, with an ADHD kid, where you have to be super consistent, because the moment you're not, they're going to get in that space. Okay, also biological. Okay, so is it biological? For example, is there something with wiring that's with the kid? They have a learning issue, they have a medical issue, they have other things that are impacting why they need services at school. Now, I'm going to lean towards school because there's the whole therapy side, but again, kids go to the biggest part of their day is at school. And if your job sucks and you hate your job, or you're not being successful at your job all day long, it's kind of hard to come home from your job and be happy. And so it's a way to think about it with kids, is that we want to make the school situation fit for them as best as possible. Now, not being mean to schools, because I'm trying to be neutral to everybody, but schools generally teach to kids who are the kids who want to learn, sit in their seat, follow along, et cetera, et cetera. If your kid's one of those kids, you're probably not on this seminar. If your kid is having issues, that's where some school districts are better than others. Some teachers are better than others. Now, I said younger is better, and I can swear to this, and I don't know if Janet will agree with me or throw darts at me, but the younger your kid is, the easier it is to get teachers to do things for your kid, and the easier it is to get an IEP. And one tip is never lose an IEP because they are harder to get once you lose it. So let me stop there and see if Janet has comments, and then we'll pop to the next slide.
Thanks, Jay. Yeah, I would agree with that in general. I think that when kids are younger, their behaviors are a little bit easier to manage, if for no other reason, just because their size is smaller, right? And our expectations of younger kids are that they're still learning, right? And as kids get older, middle school, certainly high school, I think the adult expectations of them are that they should already know how to do these things, and they should already know how to behave in the classroom setting. And they're larger in size, and so managing their behaviors can be more complicated. And I think the anxiety of the adults trying to manage their behaviors can be higher, because they're no longer, you're not dealing with a small child, which can be easier to direct. You're dealing with a child that's larger in size. So I do think that is true. And I also think that that's, that's why people like us get involved, is because we have to reframe those perspectives. And that if a student is struggling with something like ADHD, managing behaviors is a lifelong process for them, right? And so we have to sort of change the perspectives of the adults that are working with them. I think that IEPs are, coveted tools, and they can be difficult to obtain. And once they're lost, more difficult to regain, particularly because a school district can say, we don't discharge an IEP lightly. So if the student was on one and we discharged it, they must have, they had met their goals, right? And so bringing them back to the table and helping the team understand why that student has those needs again can be a difficult process. So I do think once you're on an IEP, it's important to protect that IEP and understand that while a student may be meeting their goals in an IEP, that doesn't mean that suddenly they've graduated from needing an IEP. That means we need to then redraft new goals, right? It probably doesn't mean that they're up to speed with their typical peers. And so we need to graduate the goals with the student, not graduate the student from the IEP.
Excellent point. Want to flip to the next? Is it going to flip?
Sure thing. You got it, Jay.
Flip to the next page. All right, so important. I love this picture. It's one of my favorite pictures ever. This is a real sculpture. And if you're a parent, you really got to appreciate just sort of looking at this sculpture. And I think it's just so cool just to consider like what we give to our kids, and our kids are a makeup of ourselves. And measurements I would like you as parents to consider with your child if they're struggling at school or even outside of school, mental health wise or whatever, is their child versus typical peers. So are you noticing them behind their typical peers in language, learning, reading, social skills, things like that? That's a really important measurement. Number two is your child versus similar peers. So, for example, if your child has autism, are they similar to other kids with autism, and understanding that every kid with autism is their own kid? But are they similar or different? And are they gaining ground or losing ground, which I'll explain in a minute? And third is themselves to themselves. Now, let me explain what this all means. So, is your child gaining ground or losing ground against typical peers? Now, if they are losing ground against typical peers for reading, for socialization, et cetera, being able to focus, sit, follow directions, then that's something that you want to take a look at. Why are they falling behind? First thing is, of course, a medical look. So having the physician take a peek and say, okay, is there something medical? Because you always want to rule that out. But is there something that's making that happen? If your child has learning issues or some other type of special need, they're probably with other kids like that. Are they losing, gaining, or holding ground against that? And then against themselves. So are they gaining ground against themselves or not? So if they're not gaining ground, because some kids, for example, with trauma, freeze. They could be 6 years old, have a traumatic event, and they are just frozen as that type of person. So you want to look at those measurements, and you all can consider your kid on that, because these are the measurements that really make a difference. And I think that the school is looking at a different measure. Now, again, trying to support the schools, they got a lot of kids, they got a bunch of things going every which way. And ideally, every kid would have their own plan, but that's not the way it goes in the world, because that's impossible. But the school, if there's a kid who's really out of control, throwing chairs, dangerous, they're going to move through the system of getting help much quicker without an attorney or Jay Berk or whoever, because they're going to move on that. But if your kid has learning problems and is falling behind, reading problems, whatever, it's a softer issue. That may not get picked up as much by the school because it's not creating that problem there in that system. So use those measures as important measures and a yardstick. Janet, you want to make a comment about this?
No, I think what you said is perfection. And I think that one of the things I often talk to parents about is how do we know when to ask for help? And this is a nice guide about when to ask for help. Particularly if it's your first child, it's hard to know, like, is this like sort of a typical progression and development of their social emotional skills, their academic skills, etc. And so I think this is a nice way to think about, how is your child progressing compared to the peers? And then, typical peers versus similar peers is a good analysis as well. So no, I think this is great.
Yeah. And those of you guys that are parents, you can think about this kind of fun. Your first kid, you're like, oh my gosh, did you guys all see this? If your kid falls and you go, oh, are you all right? And they start crying because they're looking at you because you're like freaking out. And if you have 3 or 4 kids, by the 4th kid, you're like, they're not bleeding, too bad. Just keep them rolling. So, and the kid doesn't react to that. My point being, the kid reacts to your reactions to things too. Is something to think about. And in terms of a meeting with the school, that can be very, very intimidating. If you haven't done this yet, it's you and a bunch of school people sitting around a table that know a lot of laws that you may not know about. So I always tell people, bring somebody who can take notes. There are advocates. Mary Jo O'Neill is one of the best in the city. She works with Janet. I'm not saying that just because she works with Janet, but she is one of the best in the city. And or maybe you have a friend, that's a teacher, somebody that knows something. And the other thing I say to people is listen, but you don't have to sign anything at that moment. I'm not an attorney, but I say, hey, listen to what they present. So can we flick to the next slide, please? All right, so once we start getting in the school situations, a lot of times there's more, punishment kind of ways to go at things. And I can tell you as a therapist, punishing an ADHD kid, for example, just doesn't work. If you have an ADHD kid, punish to your heart's content. Usually it doesn't work. It's reinforcement that actually works. Schools, by nature, have to have systems where if a kid does something, they're punished. Now, I get that, but there's lots of different ways to make that punishment be effective. For example, you get a punishment a kid learns from, where they have to research what they did wrong and present a paper about it, versus sitting 3 days suspended, and which does them absolutely no good because they're sitting at home playing video games while their parents are at work. That's a joke, but actually true. So punishment, if you are following this seminar, you want to think about this. This is the psychologist side. It only reduces the frequency of negative behavior. Sometimes, being that it does not increase the frequency of a behavior we're trying to get. I'll say that again. It will reduce the frequency of negative behavior sometimes, but it does not guarantee you're going to increase the behavior you're trying to get. Why not? Because the kid's got a missing skill. If the kid has a missing skill, it's not going to magically come along. So they're acting out. Like I have a kid who's in 8th grade that I work with who has been suspended, I don't know, bunches of times already for saying stupid stuff. And he's trying to make friends, and he gets suspended for saying stupid stuff. And it's a social deficit. ADHD kids, if they can't focus, you don't teach them focus skills, it's a problem. Kids with reading issues, here's an example. Mary Jo knows way more about this than I know, but I've had examples where the kid is acting out because they just can't read. Put them on Wilson reading, all of a sudden the world opens up and they read because they were taught phonics and they can't read. So what skill is missing? And how will it be taught, and by whom are you going to teach it? Who's going to teach it? Now, Janet can talk way about more of this than I can, but we're talking the school end of things. As a parent, you got to think about it this way. If your kid is visually impaired, the school can't say, we don't have anybody that teaches visually impaired kids. That's a problem. They have to provide that service to your kid. So, it doesn't have to be, and this is important, it does not have to be the Lexus of services. It can be the Ford, but they have to provide at least the Ford of services to your kid. And I think that's something to be thoughtful about. The other part is the school cannot generally do this alone. So it's what you're doing at home to support it, what you're doing outside to support it, such as tutoring or specialized tutoring. And in terms of therapy, if a kid's turned off, if you don't get them tuned in, you can shove all the IEPs their direction you want, all the 504 plans, all the interventions, and they're just going to be like not moving at all. Because you can't make a kid do something. Now, a lot of parents have trouble with this statement And they're like, oh, yes, I can. And the answer is, no, you can punish them if they don't do it. You can reward them if they do. But bottom line is, you can't make a kid do something they don't want to do. And a lot of kids are having depression earlier, anxiety earlier, and they freeze. And because of that freezing, those interventions don't work. So it's sort of, it takes a village. And I'm going to flip it back to Janet on this one.
Yeah, I would add to that. I had a recent conversation that's really relevant to this with a family. Um, with our older kids in particular, if they're not receptive to a strategy or a therapy or a treatment, I think there is a moment to talk as parents about whether or not you're spinning your wheels. And it may be time to put that strategy or treatment or therapy on the shelf and try something different, right? And bring it back when they're more receptive. So, for example, if you have a kiddo with ADHD that's really not in a mindset of acceptance, they're really not accepting of the fact that they have ADHD. They're not accepting of, like sometimes our middle school, high school age kids don't appreciate the point of an IEP, and they have some insecurities around the fact that they have an IEP. What we need to do is find where they are receptive and lean into those areas where they're receptive and take a minute and pause. We can't, like I have a kiddo with ADHD that I'm helping that is not currently receptive to supports around social emotional, but is more receptive to executive functioning supports. And so our plan is lean into the executive functioning where we can get traction right now and do some light social emotional support until they're more receptive, because we can continue to put those social emotional skills in front of them, but then we may actually create more long lasting resistance to that. And so we're going to lean into where we're making gains and be ready when that student's ready to be receptive for the other skills.
All right, two other interesting facts I can put you with it, which is if you've got little kids and they're like, oh, I get to be pulled out with Mrs. Smith and she's going to show me attention, they're happy with that. You got a teenager, they're like, the last thing I want to do is look different than any other teenager. So that's a problem with the IEP process. And the other thing, just going further direction, is what if your kid has more severe mental health problems? Okay, they're super depressed, super anxious. Okay, they've had a suicide attempt, things like that. You have to meet the mental health needs first. Now, as I said, we have an alternative education program in my office. And what I say is our program is mental health first, education second. And my belief in that is that unless you fix the mental health problem, they're never going to be educated because they're too depressed, too anxious to get educated. And if your kid's attending regular school, if they're so worried about being picked on or they're worried about being embarrassed in front of their peers, mental health first, because it's the key. Okay, you want to flick slides, please?
Sure thing. And I'll tell you, we say the same thing in our practice, Jay. So if we have a kiddo that comes to us that's experiencing some significant mental health concerns, our advice to the parents is we need to stabilize first and educate second, because what we're navigating when we're seeking IEPs and other school supports are barriers to learning. Some barriers to learning can be supported through accommodations in the school setting. A significant mental health situation is something that can't be supported. And what we need to sometimes advise our clients to do is pause, stabilize the mental health concerns, because as long as that mental health is in the forefront of that student's brain, it is going to be a barrier to learning. And there is going to be very little traction on academics. And so we need to, stabilize, then educate.
I like that. Maybe your term's better than mine. That's pretty cool. All right.
You can steal it.
No, I'm not going to steal. When and how do we intervene? All right. So earlier is easier. You heard me say that a bunch of times. I hope you believe me by now. So most people, I think, and Janet can say what she thinks, but most people will start with the pediatrician at the yearly check-in. And there's like, well, it's a little bit different than this or something like that. There's a little flag there. Maybe the school will bring the kid to your attention. That's usually if you have a sharp, early young teacher, teacher works with young kids, might be like, hey, have you thought about, the reason for that, just so you know, is the teacher can't say, geez, I think your kid has ADHD, because then they could get sued or something bad could happen. But they're like, they can say something like, hey, I had another kid with ADHD who had the same symptoms. It's all in the way they say it. But that's usually where it starts. So if you're going to meet with the school, I always tell people first, just go in and gather info. Okay, what do they say? If you have a younger kid, go on a field trip with them. See, is your kid really the kid who's different than the other kids? Get some observations on the playground. I said, grab an advocate to go with you. That's a person who knows the laws. Um, Janet can talk more about this, but sometimes if you bring an advocate, it's a little softer because they're not an attorney. If you bring an attorney, the other school district's going to attorney up often, and it's a little easier to start on the lower level. And you don't always have to do an IEP or 504 plan. And for parents that aren't familiar out there, they think an IEP and a 504 plan are the same thing. They're not the same thing. IEP is special ed, 504 is accommodation. They are very different things. And especially if the kid gets in trouble, an IEP offers them much more protection. And the other thing to just think about is they have to offer specialized instruction in an IEP, where a 504 plan could be a kid who's diabetic, who needs to be able to leave the room and go down and get, insulin shots or something from the nurse. So just be aware of, if you're walking into those meetings, what you're talking about. When to seek a mental health professional. I don't know why I've been doing this over 30 years. And man, there are a lot of people who come in with a kid in high school, and I'm like, where were you younger days? And not that the parents are bad people, but it's like it's so much easier the earlier on that it just has a higher success rate. So sometimes parents will come in and consult with me without the kid and just say, hey, this is what we're seeing. Sometimes they'll bring the kid in and it's just a touch base, and I could give them feedback on, is this somebody who needs help, or maybe they don't need therapy, they need something else, and I will direct them to something different. For example, if you have a good clinician and they're not in their wheelhouse, they're going to direct you to maybe a different service that is better. Okay, maybe the kid's anxious, but they're anxious because they're dyslexic. They're dyslexic because they're not getting Wilson reading. And I'm going to refer you to people that do Wilson reading and say, if you need therapy, come back, but try this first. Okay, so what type of mental health professional? So psychiatrists are doing meds mostly. Very few psychiatrists do therapy. Some do, but that's not as much what they do. Waits for a child psychiatrist right now could be over 6 months in the city of Cleveland. So that can be hard. So a lot of times pediatricians are involved with medication. And certainly not every kid needs medication. That's a big decision. But I always tell parents, look, if you're doing pills, it's pills and skills together. If you think pills are going to do it for any of those diagnoses without skills, unlikely, very unlikely. So be aware of wait lists. Most good clinicians have wait lists. That's because of what's going on with mental health in today's world. But I can tell you also that, if you're one of the people that knows the people in the city that have been around doing this for a while, and you go to the school and you ask the school, who should my kids see? Some of the same names come up with psychologists, pediatricians, etc. Know the difference between a social worker, a counselor, a psychologist. There are big differences. I'm not going to spend hours and hours on this, but also just know that the person has the expertise for your kid's need. And if they don't, then they should be referring you to somebody who does. And that's an ethical thing they should be doing. Okay, so who is good ask other parents, ask the school. Okay, stay involved in your kid's therapy. So any kid, and I'm just saying this, that comes to see me, they're going to have a goal, and we're going to be reviewing that goal. One of the things that makes me crazy is I will get kids here that have been in therapy with another therapist for 2 years, and I say, "What'd you do?" And they're like, parents go, "I don't know. We took them there weekly." And the kid will be like, "I played chess and talked." "Well, what'd you talk about?" "I don't know." Okay, so that might have been good, might not have, but you want to have goals. So I would say there's some tips for getting started, and I'll turn it back to Janice. Sorry, Janet.
Yeah. So I'll share that, I like the point about the advocate, and I think it's something that we talk to all of our clients about, that the image of an attorney is something that is often um, cloaked in adversarial posture. And that's not the type of attorney I am. That's not the type of education practice we have here at Hickman and Lauder. I think that my job as an attorney representing families is to leave the school relationships better than I found them. Right. So I should not be doing harm to those relationships. You have to live with your school and your school people long after you're working with me. So I do have a different approach than most attorneys can even exercise in their practice. But we also are very purposeful about when we send in the advocate and when we send in the attorney. And there, so it is good to have someone like Mary Jo on our team. She's invaluable to our practice. The ability for her to go in and provide the advocate's touch, sometimes that's exactly what you need. And to that point, being a collaborative advocate on your child's behalf is imperative.
Yeah.
So it's, I think this is really challenging sometimes because we passionately care about our children, and that's emotional inherently. But it's important to be collaborative for a variety of reasons. And so we tell all of our clients, when you hire us, know that we are going to go in with a collaborative, friendly tone. We're going to be firm when we need to be, but collaborative and cooperative are very important postures when you're working with your school team. And I think it's important to know that most of our school teams are really trying to do the right thing.
Yeah.
Sometimes they have too many students, they're overwhelmed, they,
Yeah.
like maybe they don't know the processes as well as they should, but they're typically, well-intentioned, good-hearted individuals. And me going in there with a fire and brimstone attitude is not fair to good educators. So I think that approach is important. I think if you can't hire an advocate, you get a warm body in the room that can take notes, because there is just a mental component of having another person in that room with you when there's a table full of educators coming for this on the school team. So I think that's really good advice.
Okay, and I'll add to that, and I'm not just saying this because I'm doing this with Janet, but there are 2 firms that I recommend, Janet's being one of them, that don't go in like bammo into the school. And they also have what I would call pre-existing relationships with a lot of districts, which they can build on, which I think is important to know. There are some attorneys that go in and are just like, bam, and that's a different story. Now, sometimes that's needed, but a lot of times nicer gets you further first.
Yeah.
And I do like what you said about a lot of times people are doing the best they can, but also something else to think about when you're sitting at that table of people, looking at the table of people, remember who's the decision maker in that room. So a teacher can make a decision in his or her classroom to some degree, but ultimately, whether they're going to get an IEP or not is a team decision. And what services are going to be there, it moves up the ladder. So there's different, responsibilities people have in that room.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. All right, so interventions. So interventions in the community, I talked about parenting support. There's individual therapy. Some kids that works with, some kids that is not. There's a lot of kids that I get referred to me that have had individual therapy. It's been a bomb. They're better in group therapy. Group therapy in a mental health setting is different than a lunch bunch, for example. It's important to know those differences. A lot of times with my teenagers, I can tell you that they respond to group therapy because one thing they find is they're not the only kid that's had the exact issue they had. A cool group I ran tonight, I'm just saying this because it was really even went better than I thought, was what thoughts you have that get in your way of being successful that you think are only your thoughts. And when kids shared them, they're like, so, nobody's going to like me, or I'm going to fail this test or whatever. Kids were like, really? You have those thoughts too? Man, all of a sudden that opens up a room that's different than somebody just doing individual therapy. And I put tutoring on the list too, because tutoring, be aware there's like tutoring that's just somebody helping your kid versus targeted tutoring with somebody with specific skills in an area that your kid needs. So be aware there are some really good tutoring companies out there. I can give you some, Janet can give you some, but that's different than just hiring a teacher who might be good for a lot of kids versus a targeted tutor. School, so informal and formal interventions. So I'm saying this because when kids are younger, and I'll make a suggestion, hey, why don't you let them get up and move around the class a little bit more, do frequent breaks. They're like, we don't need a plan to do that. We'll just do it with the kid. And that's great. But as they get older, if you don't formalize that, it's probably not going to happen. Younger is easier. I've said that a bunch of times. What type of school is important too? Now, we are lucky in Cleveland. There are a lot of good alternative programs and schools, but they are very different. So there's schools for kids with behavior problems where they're restrained kids. There's schools for kids with autism, with kids that are more extreme autism. There's schools for kids with mental health issues. There's short-term IOPs, which are intensive outpatient programs, which provide education. Now, the reason I'm saying this, there's a bunch of things we're lucky in Cleveland that we have, but fitting them to the right place is important if your kid needs some type of specialized school. But the key is what skills are missing and how are they going to get taught those skills? And I'm repeating that because if you don't teach the skills, you give them mads, you can do whatever you want to do, but you're going to lose. So I'm going to move to the next slide because I know we're running low on time. Okay, so consider what skills are missing. So if they're having temper tantrums, these are examples. They need to use to learn to use their words. Some kids get frozen on those. Are they parallel play and they haven't switched to interactive play? What that means is I have kids that can sit in a room and play video games with another kid, but they don't really interact at all versus kids that learn to actually interact with another kid. Are they at home or do they explore their world? So by exploring the world, they go to another kid's house. They have to learn to eat food they don't always eat. They might go by different rules in that house. And one of the things that's cool about this is, that's a picture from my camp on the right. The reason I picked this is it's the Gaga pit. And if you haven't played Gaga, it's a great game. It's sort of like dodgeball, but you got to hit the person below the knees. So little kids have an advantage sometimes over the big kids. But the point is when we play Gaga, if you have 40 kids playing Gaga and they come from different schools, they all have different rules. And one of the rules that always is a conflict is if the ball gets hit on a fly ball and a kid outside the Gaga pit catches it in the air, they get to go in and that kid comes out. So exploring the world. Friendships. A lot of kids have acquaintance friends, but they never make what I call friends. Okay. And so it's sad. I met with two kids today. They're in middle school. They have no lunch table. One kid sits by himself totally. The other kid's at a lunch table of kids that were his friends, that are no longer his friends. And he just is stuck at that table. He's in 8th grade. And I didn't really realize this. They have assigned tables, so he's stuck. And if your kid gets to the age where they're doing a Washington trip or something like that, that really becomes apparent if they don't have friends. Playing versus hanging out. So kids go from play dates, where usually the moms or dads set them out, to hangouts where the kids have to set them up. And that's a progress that needs to happen. So what skills are missing if those aren't happening? Hygiene should become self-driven. When kids are little, the parents are throwing the kid in the shower, but by adolescence, they should be doing it themselves. If not, that's a problem. Homework, this is a big one. Really, you want to get to the point where your kid is doing homework and they're self-managed and they're coming to you for help. You're not managing them in terms of their homework. And that's the executive function part that I see. Now, there are a number of kids that I've had, and I'm just going to say this because I think it's important to hear, where the parents overfunction for them. So they've done well at school, and I have kids that have gone off to Ohio State Honors College on a full scholarship and fail out because they never learn the skill. Now, if their mom would have gone to college with them, that would have been great, but they never transferred the skill. So you have to transfer that skill to your kid. Okay, let's pop slides and keep moving along here. So consider talking about topics. Kids on the spectrum, for example, only talk about their high interests. So it's space. They'll talk about space. They don't switch to other topics. And that kills them socially. Talks with meaning to parents and friends. So they have to be able to do, I have a book called Code Shifting, and they have to be able to code shift. Like, you talk to parents different than friends. For example, most middle school kids know the jokes, especially boys, that's really sexist, but the jokes you tell your friend at the lunch table in middle school, you would not tell your mom. And you certainly would not tell the teacher. And when to narc out other kids and when not to. There's another example. So that's really important. Kids on the spectrum have real trouble with number 3, and this is something that needs to be integrated into a school. How do I see it, and how do you see it? So, for example, I had a girl I work with that she'll say something that she thinks is funny, and other people don't find it so funny. So she said something to her stepmom about her stepmom's kid not visiting her, which she thought was funny and was really a bomb with the step parent. But these kids often don't understand how other people see their comments. Now, this is where I get kids suspended, I get kids expelled, I get lots of crazy stuff. And I say, call Janet and get it figured out. But a lot of times they don't mean it, they just blew it. And when we were kids, I said to my best friend 1,000 times, I'm going to kill you. But in today's world, do you say that? And it's a way different world. And lastly, what they want, and do they act with remorse? So yeah, kids make mistakes. And when they make mistakes, what we're looking for is if they have remorse. I have cases of kids that do not have remorse. And that is a very scary thing, because if you're looking for one of the number one predictors of kids that are going to end up incarcerated, that would be one of the big factors. You want to flip slides and we'll keep going. Electronics. So I talked a bit about this in the beginning. There's a whole book on it, but let me hit quick on it. So I love this picture because if you got little kids, they're on the phone. What age are kids getting phones nowadays? It amazes me. It's crazy. So you hand your kid a phone, you hand them an entrance to a whole world. And example, like, what age are kids first exposed to gaming? And is gaming addictive to kids? Of course it is. It's designed that way. Social media. Okay, kids can be evil. This is where I'll do even it up, because I did a boy thing, I'll do a girl thing. Girls especially can be super evil on social media, especially by middle school. They'll be like, we all went here and we just want to show you pictures so that you know that you weren't invited. And that really makes kids feel bad. But electronics, kids are socializing in electronics now. And I'm not going to keep belaboring the point because I do a whole seminar on this. But the other thing is bad websites, porn websites, and things. Y'all can think about what is the average age you think kids nowadays see a porn site. Janet, you want to put your guess in?
No, I can't even imagine.
Okay,
Hit me with a J.
it's 11.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. So, and where do they see it from? Most often, an older kid shows them something on their phone, on the bus, or somewhere like that. So, inoculating your kid against these things is important. Parents are like, well, so and so got a phone, and my kid's bugging me, so I give him a phone. My favorite one is, well, how am I going to get in touch with them if there's an emergency? And the answer is, every kid around them has a phone, and the school has a phone. So that's just enough on that. Can you flick to the next slide? Okay, so the goal is to raise a healthy, well-balanced child. Today's world is much more difficult than it used to be on that one, for sure. And there's a lot that goes into it. So I'm going to stop here for a sec and let Janet chime in and then see if there's questions.
Yeah, so I'm going to kind of jump into the education piece, and I'll do this in 10 seconds or less, but I think we can do it. Um, So one of the things I like to touch on when I can in these talks is trauma. So this is just a quick slide around trauma. Again, we have Jay Berk, who this is, he's the mental health professional, so I won't try to steal his job. But I like to touch on this because an area of interest for me is working with children that have experienced foster care and or adoption, and that often comes with some early experiences with trauma that can impact development, which puts an added layer of advocacy to my role, and that I often have to educate our educators about trauma and how it impacts development. So I just take a minute here to highlight the impact of trauma, and that one way to articulate the impact of trauma is through something called ACE scores, adverse childhood experience scores. And the quick explanation is what it does is examine traumatic experiences that child has endured. So those can be experiences that they have occurred to them directly, like some form of abuse or environmental aspects. So, for example, separation and divorce, or witnessing something, some sort of abuse to one of their parents that it wasn't directly inflicted to them, but it was in their environment. And these things can add up to an ACE score. And that can sometimes help quantify the topic of trauma without having to dive into the details of what happened to that student. Um, Jay mentioned it many times, early is best. So early intervention is imperative. It really helps put our kiddos on good footing. So what I always like to do a plug for the early intervention process, which is for our kiddos age 0 to 3. So you can connect with Help Me Grow to get you started on that. And then it creates a really smooth transition to school and IEP services. Talking about school support. So when you have a kiddo that's showing behaviors, at school, we need to start thinking about supports. And supports come in 3 different forms generally. Informal supports, response to intervention type supports, 504 plans, and IEPs. So, one of the things that we will see is before a kiddo has qualified for a 504 or an IEP, there are some informal interventions being utilized. And I like to just make sure they're documented. That's probably my number one first question when a parent says, the school team's doing some stuff right now to help support them. What are they doing? Let's document it. Like maybe they don't qualify for an IEP just yet, but we want to be clear on how that student was being supported. If they're getting supports that are not being provided to the rest of the students in the classroom. So I'm gonna, in the interest of time, kind of breeze past this very quickly, but this will be provided to you guys afterwards. So this is just a breakdown of the difference between IEPs and Section 504 plans. I would say the biggest thing here is eligibility, like how you qualify to be eligible, and what you get once you qualify. So in an IEP, you can get a lot of the same things you can get in a 504. You can get accommodations in an IEP, you can get related services in an IEP. However, what you can't get is specially designed instruction. So if you have a student whose disability is impacting them in the school setting such that they can't perform certain tasks or they're struggling in a social emotional way, they often need specially designed instruction to help them build the skill. Where are the gaps in skills and how do we help them build this skill with specially designed instruction? And that's when you tip the scales from a 504 to an IEP.
Yeah, Janet, I think
Go ahead.
I think you flipped that a little bit. Originally in the first part.
Oh,
I think you were meaning the first part you were saying.
oh, yes, yes, right. Okay. So
not to
let me,
correct the attorney, but you know.
it's been a long day. So to be clear, when so let me go back for a second. What you can get in an IEP versus a 504, accommodations, you can get in both. Related services, you can get in both, although I tend to see them more often in an IEP. Specially designed instruction, that's IEP territory, right? And so when a kiddo starts has a disability that impacts them such that they need specially designed instruction, we need to be in IEP territory, and that needs to be documented on an IEP. All right, so the IEP process, how do we get qualified for an IEP? I'm going to go through this really quick, but you guys are going to have this afterwards. So first, it starts with a request for an IEP, and that needs to be done in writing because the IDEA, which is the law that governs IEPs, has very specific deadlines for when the school has to complete that each aspect of the IEP process. So we want to make sure that our request is made in writing because that's essentially a timestamp. So once a parent requests an IEP, the district has 30 days to make a formal response to that request. The way that actually works is that they would schedule a meeting. They often refer to it as a suspicion meeting, which can sound kind of wonky to parents. But what that means is they are going to gather the school team to have a meeting about that student's needs and whether the team suspects there's a disability that's impacting them in the school setting. The key word here is suspect, not know, right? So you can start to have this discussion and it can start to sound like we know or we don't know. It doesn't need to be that definitive. It just needs to be a suspicion because that moves us to the assessment stage. And the assessment stage is where we make a definitive determination about whether they meet those IEP standards. So within 30 days, the district has to either agree to evaluate or decline to evaluate. If they agree to evaluate, then you will have a planning meeting where you will map out what evaluations will be completed and by whom. And then the district has 60 days to complete what's called an evaluation team report. And you will come together to have an ETR meeting. At that ETR meeting, you will review all of the assessments that the school district completed. And then you will make a determination at the end of that meeting about whether that student is eligible for an IEP. Meaning, does that student have one of 13 identified, one of 13 specific disabilities that are identified in the law? And if they have one of those 13 disabilities, does it have a negative impact in the school setting such that they need specially designed instruction? That gets to be a nuanced conversation. That's why it's always helpful to have somebody going to these meetings with you that can help you remember the talking points and just give you that extra support to be a strong advocate. And that's also a reason why people reach out to Mary Jo and myself. If the team determines that they do qualify for an IEP, they have 30 days to create and begin implementing an IEP. This is just a quick
comment about that just for 1 sec.
Yeah, go for it.
I'll be really brief. So real brief. Can you back up 1 slide real quick?
Sure.
Okay, so just if you look at this, just consider this for a second. Your kid's starting to have issues. Before there's a real plan in place moving can be a long time.
Yeah.
Okay, so it depends how urgent it is or isn't, but one is if it's not urgent, it's a process and you have to stay with it. If it's an urgent issue, like there's a big thing happening, and I think I'm correct about this, Janet, if there's a suspected disability, do they not have to consider that if the kid has a discipline issue?
Yes. So if it's already on the school's radar, say, for example, you're in process, but you haven't gotten to the stage of having an IEP, then the school would have to do something like a manifestation determination review.
Yeah, I think that's important for parents to hear.
Yeah. Yep.
That's it. That's my 2 points.
Yep. So this is just a brief slide on IEP eligibility. The high points here are the 13 disability categories, which I alluded to on the last slide. There's a 14th here, which is sort of like a soft category. Developmental delay is something that's available until a child is 10. So it's important to know that for our younger age kiddos. And then here's essentially what the school team is going to look at when they're making that determination about whether a student is eligible. So the whether they meet one of those 13 disability categories. And then you see here the child demonstrates an educational need that requires specially designed instruction. That's the kicker. And so that's the important question that we need to answer during this process. Once we have an IEP draft in front of us, we're going to be looking at accommodations, services, and modifications. So a nice way to think about this is what are we supporting, and then what accommodations match those supports. So these are just examples that each child has a different mix of needs and accommodations. And the other thing to know about sort of the structure of an IEP is it begins with a profile that sort of defines the background of that student and their needs. We'll often recap the assessments that were completed during the ETR, and then it moves into the goal section, which is where we specifically identify goals. You know, where are those gaps in skills, and how are we going to close those gaps? That's your goals. And then your accommodations come next. So your accommodations should be tied to those goals. And you really should be able to like weave through each section and see the relation between the goals and the accommodations and the services that are provided. Services are things like occupational therapy, speech and language therapy. They can be provided direct or consultative. So direct is when the student is meeting with that professional. Consultative is when the occupational therapist or the speech and language pathologist is providing advice to the classroom teacher. Sometimes you need both, depending on the student's needs.
Okay,
One thing I want to, yeah, go ahead.
One quick hint from Heloise. I'll be real brief.
Yeah.
One thing parents are not aware of that I find is that when you get an IEP, you think it's good for a year, and it is good for a year, but you can have an IEP every day of the year if you want to repeat and open it up. So going back to a Janet type person, you know, if it's not working or if it needs changes, a lot of people think it's set in stone, but 2 months go by and it's not working right, you can reopen that up.
Yeah. You can ask for an IEP meeting at any time. So there's a requirement of an annual review. But if something's not working, you as a parent and a parent as part of the team can ask for an IEP meeting to review what's going on with the kiddo and whether we need to make adjustments to the IEP. Some of the things I listed under what need are we supporting, sort of trying to gear towards some of the things that might lead to behaviors. But I want it noted that I list academics here because I think, you know, when we start looking at what's underlying the behaviors, I think we're often looking for things like anxiety and, you know, like self-esteem, things like that. But sometimes it's academics. Sometimes it's that kiddo really is struggling with reading or really struggling with math, and they're developing avoidance behaviors. And those avoidance behaviors are snowballing into like more overt problematic behaviors in the school setting. So I don't want to overlook the role of academics in the manifestation of behaviors. The last thing I'll note on here, and Jay alluded to this earlier, is it's really important as we're developing strategies to help support students that we begin to, we first provide those strategies, then we teach them to our students. We begin to fade the adult supports around those strategies so that we ultimately create independence. And that's a process. We can't, I talked to a family this week whose school was providing these certain this supports and scaffolding around assignments. And then in middle school, we're like, nope, we're taking them away because they have to be able to do it on their own in high school, but they didn't fade the support. So all of a sudden the students started to fall apart because there wasn't sufficient teaching and fading before they took the support away completely.
Okay, I'll make one more hint from Heloise to support you, huh? Just real
Yeah.
quick, I'd also say from the behavioral aspect, no kid gets up in the morning and says, I want to make life miserable for everybody in my path. There's a reason that they're doing it, and that's the key to figure out why they're doing it. And that's where the therapy in my office type therapy and IEP or 504 needs to intervene.
Yep. Okay, so I'm just going to talk about discipline for a hot second. Here's the tragedy of what Jay and I probably often see is students that are being disciplined but not being supported. So when we encounter a student that has mostly or entirely been experiencing discipline and not positive behavior intervention supports or other sophisticated tools like FBAs, which we'll talk about in a minute. So, I really, to me, that's tragic because we've missed an opportunity to truly support that student and shift behaviors. Just purely treating a student with discipline is not going to solve problems. So here's just a quick peek at the different discipline maneuvers. It's important to know that in Ohio, in grades K to 3, school districts are not supposed to be utilizing out of school suspensions except for in specific situations where there's an increased risk. So these are, significant dangerous activities. Otherwise, the school team should be focusing on positive behavior intervention supports. And if they have to, an in-school suspension. When it comes to suspensions, you should get a written notice and an opportunity to discuss that suspension, an informal hearing. That's a good time to present alternatives to suspension. It is really important to know that for most of our kids, suspension is a reward. Not going to school is a reward. So let's think of other ways to address discipline than rewarding them for their behavior, right? So that's an important moment to say, wait, before you suspend my kid, what alternatives are there? Even if it's an in-school suspension versus an out-of-school suspension. Expulsion comes in 3 forms, typically 80 days, 1 year if there's a more escalated risk involved, or permanent in a very specific situation where a student is 16 years or older and convicted of a serious criminal offense. Emergency removal is sort of a cousin to these discipline, suspension and expulsion. This is where the district removes the student from the school because they're posing an imminent harm to others, themselves or other people. It's short term, 24 hours or less. The parents need to be notified immediately, but that typically sets off a whole process. And this is when a student is, in a school setting and starts making threats or has a big behavioral moment where they are causing harm to themselves or others, and the district emergency removes them. Then they need to follow up. Is that emergency removal? Are we transitioning back to school within 24 hours? Or are we transitioning to a suspension or other sort of things that we need to do before the student can return safely to school? So special considerations for our students with special education needs. And we could talk about this for days, Jay, but I'm going to do this quick and dirty. So these are some important terms you need to know. Functional behavior assessment. So when a student starts to demonstrate behaviors in school, again, the discipline is not the only way to address them and not the best way to address them. So we have a tool called a functional behavior assessment. And what this is it's a full-blown assessment where the school psychologist or a BCBA does an assessment to determine what the underlying behaviors are, what are the antecedents related to those behaviors, and then begins to craft a behavior intervention plan based on that FBA. So an FBA, the point of an FBA is to understand the root of the behaviors. What is generating the behaviors? When do the behaviors tend to happen? Right? So this is your classroom teachers as part of an FBA process should be collecting data around, is that behavior more likely to happen in the morning, the afternoon, at lunchtime, when they come back from recess, during a particular subject. Maybe a student that's not great at math tends to have more outbursts during math class. Maybe a student who has a really hard time transitioning from recess and the excitement of recess to the structured environment of sitting back down at their desk, and they tend to have more behaviors after recess. Maybe a student has more behaviors when their medication's wearing off in the afternoon. Pinpointing the timing of behaviors, the activities that happen around behaviors, before behaviors. The other thing to identify in a functional behavior assessment would be how long the behaviors last and what they look like. Because all of this information is imperative for a good behavior intervention plan. So you'll move from an FBA to a BIP, a behavior intervention plan. And this is a specific plan to help address the student's behaviors. And what we do here is we kind of want to support them two ways. We want to support what creates the behavior. So hopefully we don't get to the behavior. Like, this shouldn't just be reactionary. This should be about addressing what's underlying the behavior. So what can we do to support that student so they never get to that moment of behavior, right? So strategies, things like breaks. Maybe the student needs more breaks because they're overtaxed by the academics and they need to be able to step away for a moment, stabilize themselves, de-escalate, or calm before they even get to an escalation, and then go back to the classroom. So what can happen before behavior? And then when a behavior does present itself, what do we do with that behavior? It should be both. Teaching a student replacement strategies. One really important thing to think about with behaviors is you can't teach an escalated student. So if you're teaching replacement strategies, it can't be happening when they're escalated. You can't be telling a student that's escalating, what could you do instead of throwing a chair? You need to teach a student replacement strategies when they are calm and regulated. So what is the Go ahead, Jay.
No, that's good.
Yeah. And then, so that's your behavior intervention plan. It should be tied to the IEP. And there's data that's tracked for it so that you can make adjustments to the behavior intervention plan. One thing that we often do is we should be doing is infusing positive behavior supports, so reinforcement systems. It's important to note that kids' interests change. So what may be part of a positive reinforcement system may need to change even mid-year, because that kid may care about Transformers at the beginning of the year, but not care about them by the time you get to Christmas, right? So we need to be able to adapt those plans accordingly. The next thing to know about is a manifestation determination review. So this is a special meeting that occurs in the discipline context. So if a student is on an IEP and they are removed from school for more than 10 days, that is technically considered a change of placement. And change of placement cannot happen without an IEP meeting and an amendment to an IEP. So what this does is, if a student is disciplined such that they are missing more than 10 days of school, it triggers an MDR. And the team comes together and they make a determination about whether that student's the incident was related to the student's disability. If the incident is related to the student's disability, the district needs to return the student to school. They cannot continue to, they cannot have them removed for more than 10 days. The other thing that happens after an MDR, if it's found that it was a manifestation of the student's disability, is there needs to be a follow-up IEP meeting where the team looks at the incident, determines, what's going on with that incident, and do we need to make changes to the IEP and or behavior plan, or if a student doesn't have a behavior plan already, we need to do an FBA and complete a behavior plan. Another thing that might be happening is maybe the FBA is outdated and we need to redo the FBA. The behavior plan probably needs amendments. And then that brings me to my last thing on this slide, independent educational evaluations. So we often think about IEEs as they relate to IEPs, but we should also think about them in the context of functional behavior assessments. So an independent educational evaluation is an evaluation that is completed by a third party and paid for by the district. So this, in the IEP context, when you complete your IEP assessments, if you disagree with the district's assessments, you can ask for an IEE, and you will go out and find a provider and the district will pay for that IEE. We can do the same thing with a functional behavior assessment. So if things are really going sideways and a kiddo's already on a behavior intervention plan, I might ask for an IEE on the FBA so that we can get another set of eyes in there, a trained certified BCBA to look at what's going on with that kiddo and make recommendations to the school team, and maybe even do some training with the school team on how to work with that student and their behaviors.
So can I do the Berk version of this from my end, from the treatment?
Yeah, you definitely can.
Real quick, bam, I'll going through it. So if the kid's starting to have issues, let's figure out what they are. That's a functional behavior assessment. If you do it right, you create a behavior plan, you're done. Life's great, everything's moving along. If you get to manifestation determination, there was a problem that got missed, and now it's messy usually. And an IEE is if everybody's not getting along, and there's got to be like somebody in there refereeing and saying, well, here's what I think. So again, the quicker you come in with the light stuff, the more effective you can be.
Absolutely.
That's my version of it from a therapist end.
That's perfect. That's a great recap. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. I think this is a dense topic, and it's something that's likely more relevant post-pandemic than it was before the pandemic. I think our kiddos, for a variety of reasons, can struggle with anxiety and behaviors and a host of things that come along with that. So it's good to have these tools. It's good to know that people like Jay and I exist to help families when they need additional support going through this process. It's really important to know that most kids, like Jay said, they do not wake up in the morning and want to and are thinking, how can I mess up the world today? How can I cause problems and chaos? It's also really important to know that behavior is generally communication of something, right? So, one section of students that I serve are nonverbal students, and their behaviors are just pure communication. So typically behavior is a student, a child communicating some sort of unmet need. And it's our job as adults to figure out what that's about and to help support them in that.
Yeah, my closing comments on that would be, I agree with all of that. And if you're a parent out there, it can be a very dense topic, but the idea being all behavior has a purpose. The key is, what's the purpose of the behavior? The earlier you read the tea leaves, and if you're not trained to read the tea leaves, get somebody who does, intervene, you're more successful.
All right, so recognizing that we have gone 8 minutes over, which I'm proud that it's only 8 minutes, Jay. Does anyone have questions? You're welcome to type it in chat or unmute yourself if you have questions.
Is there questions in chat too or something?
I don't think I saw. I've been trying to track it, but I'll take one peek to make sure that we didn't miss anything.
Yeah, while you're doing that, I'll just say, remember, you want to try to work in tandem with your district as best as possible, because that's the key if everybody's all working together for your kid.
Yep, a school to home connection is important. Well, seeing no questions, I will wrap us up. Thank you for joining us on a Wednesday evening. And feel free to reach out anytime if you feel like you need additional support. Jay, thank you for being here.
It was fun. Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Yeah.